Welcome, everybody, to this week's eLearning Career Chat, where we talk with different professionals in our industry about their career journeys and what they're working on this week. I am so happy to have Leslie Early with us today. Leslie's an instructional designer and host of her own podcast, That's Awesome ID, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So welcome, Leslie. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me, Tim. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. I know I reached out to you earlier in the year and we weren't able to make this happen. And it feels like, I will tell you, I have been on a lot of different podcasts over the last year or so. And being on yours was very memorable for me. I think I was on it last fall. And one of the things that I really appreciated about being on your podcast is you could tell that you went and you researched me and you had really specific questions that I don't remember. Gosh, I don't think anybody else would have ever asked me unless they spent the time looking at what I put online. And I just have to say, as on being on the opposite end of something like this, I really, really appreciated your prep work. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, I can say just to give back a little story about that.
Yeah.
I think you were one of the within the first 10 episodes, I'm sure.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And I was so naive and so new to instructional design at the time that I saw on LinkedIn that you had the eLearning Designer's second version was coming out, the handbook. So I had it, I was looking at it, I was liking it, and I just naively reached out to you and just did a cold message on LinkedIn, and then didn't. After the fact, people were like, how did you get Tim Slade to be on your podcast? And I was like, I don't know. I just asked him to be I didn't realize at the time that people thought this would be such a big deal. But I'm super grateful to you that you were so generous with your time and willing to come on my tiny little podcast at that time.
That's so funny. The important lesson there is that all you had to do was reach out. I can't think of all the messages I get, and I don't think there's ever been a time where somebody's asked me to be on their podcast and I've said, no, you're not worth my time. So lesson to anybody out there, if you have a podcast or if you have a thing and you want somebody to be on it, just ask. Just reach out. That's all it takes.
Yeah.
So, well, good. Well, so tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do. And more specifically, I'm curious for you to share, and I always ask this of everybody who joins one of these conversations, to share how they got into learning and development and their career journey. So I know that's a lot. So
yeah,
take as much time as you'd like.
Yeah, well, I'm a Libra. No, just kidding. My background is mostly in education. So I was an educator for 10 years. I taught English in South Korea for 8 years, if anyone can believe that. Yeah, it was an interesting chapter in my life. And then I was also in a third grade classroom for 2 years in the United States. And then after about 10 years, I was like, I think I'm done being in a classroom. This was nice, but I think I'm ready to move on. But I didn't know exactly what that was going to look like yet. So my transition into ID took a few years. I took an admin job at a law firm, and
oh wow.
So I was just paying the bills for a while because I didn't know what my next step really was going to be. But then I love learning and I'm super curious. So I'm always browsing new classes I can take or different things like that. And also I was trying to find what my next step was. So I found on edX, I found a post, a professional certificate program for instructional design and technology. So I was like, I guess I'm going to see what this is about. And when I was going through that program, I realized that instructional design encompasses all the things I loved about teaching, like curriculum design, lesson planning, creatively solving different problems for people, analysis. It combines the analytical and creative parts of my brain, and which I really enjoyed. So after I started going through that program, I was like, I think this is it. This is where I need to go. This is where the universe is pulling me. So I actually rolled that professional certificate program into a full master's and was continuing to work at the law firm. And while I'm going through my coursework, I was developing training for them, onboarding things for them, because they had very specific pieces of law that, people needed to be trained in on. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's kind of it. And then once I graduated, I did a little bit of contract work. I started up my podcast because actually the master's program, I have to give it to them. They were like, you need to they started with building your presence. They were the ones that like, what's your plan once you graduate? How are you going to network? How are you going to, stay up to date on what's going on in the industry? And so we really had to formalize that plan. And I think out of that is where sort of was like, how am I going to grow my network? So
Yeah.
because I'm an introvert, and it's I'm the kind of person, I don't naturally just reach out to people.
Sure.
So the podcast was my way of sort of formalizing. This is my excuse for reaching out to people and talking to people, because I have like this little formal place that I've created where those conversations can happen. So yeah. And
I
then
love
after,
Oh, go ahead, go ahead.
well, the very last is now I am working full time as an ID and
Yeah.
e-learning developer. And yeah, that's the whole story.
Yeah, I remember when I was on your podcast. I remember I think we were chatting before or after the recording, or maybe this was on the podcast. I don't remember, but I remember you telling me about how you had fallen into this industry and you just started the podcast as a way to connect with people and network and put yourself out there. And I remember. Maybe I didn't say this to you, but this is my sentiment, if whether or not I remember saying this to you or not. But I remember thinking, gosh, that's such like good for you. How brave is that to just kind of throw yourself out there like that? And so many people, I think, could benefit by putting themselves out there in one way or another, whether it's a podcast or webinars like this or writing blog posts, but they hesitate because they don't feel like they get stuck in their head, like, who am I to be having a podcast about
Hmm.
learning and development, or who am I to write a blog post about this, that, or the other thing, or who am I to start a YouTube channel? And so I commend you for doing that, because it's super brave and courageous to kind of throw yourself out there like that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
I can see that, but I also feel like, I don't know, I think because it started as just I was just talking to people that were sort of my friends anyway, like
Sure.
sort of acquaintances, so it felt safe in the beginning, and
That makes
then
sense.
it's kind of low stakes. I sort of was like, "Oh, 8 people will listen to this," you know what I mean? So, um, and it was just a way it also was a way to, learn. Again, really, to meet people, to have an excuse to talk to people, and to
Hmm.
learn from people, and, that was really the motivation, and for that, it didn't matter necessarily how many people listen to it. I mean, it's great that people can listen to it and get value from it and learn
Yeah.
with us, but for me, as long as it gave me the structure to keep moving forward with those conversations and keep moving forward with my own learning. So the fact that other people get something from it is great, but it was already fulfilling for me, even if it stayed, 8 listeners. So
Yeah, for sure. Well, so before we continue talking about building a presence online and different ways that people can go about doing that and why they should be doing that, one of the things that you mentioned, you kind of mentioned this in passing a moment ago, talking about your career. And I feel like it's so relevant right now because there's so many people out there trying to do what you did in one way or another. But the thing that you mentioned is that your transition took a few years
Mhm.
for that to really, you know, uh, become to self-actualize yourself from what you were doing before into what you're doing now. Can you speak to those people who are current or former teachers or whatever it is that they're doing, trying to transition into this industry? I think sometimes the marketing out there, if you will, just makes it sound like, it's really easy to transition and it's just going to happen by taking a course or by building a portfolio. And that's part of it, right? But it does take a lot of time. Can you speak to that a little bit and just give a little bit of your experience on the fact that it does take time?
Yeah, well, I think a big part of the time for me is that I first needed to know where I was going and what I wanted. So that
Yeah.
was a big step of it. But I I'm really happy with my decision to, go more of the formalized education route, just because that was what that was an avenue that was accessible to me, because I
Sure.
wasn't, I mean, I was in the law firm, so I guess I could have sort of, we didn't really have formal trainers, so it's not like I could, pivot into that department because it didn't exist where I was. So I think some
Hmm.
people can make that transition without a formalized education if they
Yep.
have the right opportunities available to them. Absolutely. But to me, there just wasn't that opportunity. So I I thought this is my way of um, sort of creating that opportunity for myself, because as I'm going through the coursework, then I could go to my supervisor and then HR and then the legal partners and say, I think there's a need for this where we are. So let me start developing some of these onboarding materials for you. And of course, they were like, yes. I mean, who's going to say no to that? So in that way, I sort of created that opportunity for myself, and made that transition in that way. And it took time because it was happening in real time, of like, I'm really developing these are real learning materials that actually exist out there in the world. It's not just something hypothetical that I created for my portfolio.
Yeah.
um, but there are some things that are hypothetical in my portfolio too.
Sure.
Anyway,
Yeah.
I don't want to diss anybody and like how they're going about their journey, but I think the best way to make the transition is wherever you are right now, either, and if you're coming from teaching, it's more difficult.
Yep.
But if you're already in a company, or if you're part of a community, or there's an organization you can volunteer for, whatever the case may be, finding a real world problem to solve that you can go out there and get the experience of going through everything from beginning to end,
Sure.
um, from the whole process. So,
Yep.
and you don't have to do that, and get paid for it necessarily. You can volunteer to do that, or do it through coursework, or through academies, or whatever the case may be.
Yep.
But it does take time, and you to be able to answer questions about the process, you're going to have to go through that process at least once or twice,
Sure.
so.
Yeah. I was talking one on one last Friday with Heidi Kirby. We were talking about this, and the thing that, and she did a post about this, I think, the other day on LinkedIn, talking about how the thing that I want people to know is that there's no front door into this industry. There's a bunch of back doors, and
Mm.
everyone's journey into this industry is unique and interesting and different. I used to catch shoplifters for a living, and that's how I got into learning. Other people got out of teaching, started doing what you were doing, went to school, and then got into learning and development. And so there
Mhm.
isn't one way to do it. I think what's important, and this is the other thing that we talked, that she alluded to in her post the other day, everyone will have to go out there and find it, is what's important is you have to make sure you're running towards something that you want, rather than running away from something that you hated or you hate.
Mhm.
I think that's important, because what you're running towards has to be greater and more important than whatever it is that you're running away from. Otherwise, what's your real intention there, right? um
Yeah.
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 Okay, good. So
Well,
let's oh, go ahead. Sorry.
well, the only thing I was gonna say is, it I love that analogy of, like, running towards something, because then that gives you the ability to focus on
Right.
what is the gap in understanding, what are the skills that I need to brush up on or fill in those
Mhm.
gaps, um, because then you can focus on it rather than just focusing on, you know, I'm just going to apply to every possible job and hope
Yep.
that the experience that I have is going to be good enough. Well, I also sort of tried that. I tried while I was still in school, started dipping my toes out there, trying to get a sense of what the market was like. And I would just bomb big time in my
Mm,
interviews because I still didn't quite have the full understanding of the whole process, and the tools that needed to be used.
sure.
Um, and people could see through that right away in the
Yep.
interviews. So,
Yep. Yep.
yeah, so it just takes time and practice like everything else.
Yep.
So,
I totally agree. Okay, so let's talk about You know, obviously for you, I think you've done a really great job working to build your presence in our industry and online through your podcast and being active online. And I'm curious to know, as you reflect on the time you've spent kind of putting yourself out there. I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I want to know your thoughts on like why should people be doing that? Whatever their career aspirations are. Like for you, as you think about the reasons you did it, to network, to get to know people, to learn, can you think about retrospectively how that has actively helped you in your career and maybe help others understand why they should consider putting themselves out there more beyond just
Yeah.
liking or commenting other people's work?
Right. So, um, through happenstance, I mean, I had a little push from my graduate program,
Sure.
but also through happenstance, I got hooked up with a woman named Lauren Greif, who's sort of a I don't want to call it, she doesn't like to be called a career coach. And I don't remember the term she prefers, but
Sure.
similar to a career coach. She has a company called Portfolio Rocket. And some of the volunteer and contract work that I did over the summer before I was a full time ID is I helped her develop a course to sort of market herself in that niche that she was trying to get to. And so
Sure.
we developed a course called Discover the Hidden Job Market. And
Mhm.
so because I was helping her develop this, I saw behind the scenes of her own e-learning academy, not e-learning academy, her own academy for this
Yeah.
type of career search, and just saw her whole curriculum and basically got a crash course because then I had to repackage it into another course about the power of the hidden job market and which is, networking and the fact that, 80% of all jobs are never listed on job boards and like you will never hear about them because they're always looking. It's cheaper and more efficient for big companies or any company really, to rely on their own professional network to fill positions than it is to post it on a job board, which is expensive, first of all, time
Mhm.
consuming because they get inundated with applicants. So just all of that it really reinforced, oh, I really gotta just put myself out there. Um, and I like how Lauren says it because she says, it's not that the job market is hidden. The problem is you yourself are hidden from the people who have the power to hire.
I love
So
that.
when you flip it around that way and look at from that angle, okay, so how do I make myself visible? I don't want to be invisible. There's millions and millions of people on LinkedIn. So how do I keep myself from falling into the background and just being another invisible? Might as well be invisible. I mean, I have a profile, but if nobody finds it or
Right.
if
Has
I
a
don't
reason to
come to,
go to it.
yeah, a reason to look for me, then what's the good of it? So I think that really hammered it in on in my brain of like, okay, I need to be posting regularly, not just to post, but to show what I care about and what I'm good at, or
Mhm.
not that I'm good at. I don't my I you can also go into personal branding, which is a whole other thing, but
Yeah.
like my brand is not I'm not trying to be the expert in the room. That was never
Yeah.
my intention because I'm brand new to the industry. I've only been here like a year or two. So I can't be the expert, but I can be a very good learner. So my brand is like, I'm a learner. So, you can say you can work out loud through social media, but I like to say I'm learning out loud. So, the
Mhm.
podcast is me learning from people in the industry. And anytime I post on LinkedIn, it's usually just saying, this is a book I'm reading. This is an interesting video series I found. This is a project I'm working on. This is a class I'm taking. It's all about what am I learning at this time and what are those things I'm learning. And if you want to learn this too, then here's a resource that you could use.
Yep.
So yeah, that's my strategy in a nutshell, and it's worked pretty well
I love
so
that. I
far.
mean, I remember Two things I want to say about that. So what you mentioned about like the job market's not hidden, but you're hidden. It reminds me of one of the things that I've written about and I've talked about in the past is about freelancing, and the kind of the line that I've used with people is, I oftentimes ask people, if you have a full-time job and you're wanting to get into freelancing, how would your current boss or your company respond if they found out you were taking on work during your nights and weekends? And so often I hear people say, well, gosh, I can't, they can't know that I'm doing this. And my response is like, well, you can't freelance in secret, because if you want to be a freelancer and earn money as a freelancer, you have to have clients. And in order to have clients, they have to know who you are. And in order for them to know who you are, you have to put yourself out there. You have to let the world know you're freelancing. Otherwise, it's going to be really, really hard to freelance in secret. And yeah, that's the one thing I wanted to say. But the other thing that I think you mentioned that I really liked is that you said, I'm not trying to be the expert in the room or the expert in this thing. And that's, I think, a huge barrier for folks when it comes to all sorts of aspects of participating in our industry, whether it's having a podcast or doing something like this or speaking at a conference or even just writing a blog post. I think people get stuck with the sense that, well, I'm not the expert, so who am I to be talking about this, that, or the other thing? And just like you, I so appreciate that you said you're not trained to be the expert, because one of the things that I proclaim as often as I can, I don't proclaim to be an expert in e-learning. I don't want to be known as the expert in e-learning. I'm not an expert in e-learning or instructional design, but I'm an expert in my experiences, and I can share my experiences with other people about storyboarding, about e-learning design, about whatever this, that, or the other thing. Nobody can dispute my experience. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that's what I try to share when I share content, put myself out there. And I think once people learn to get over the hump that you don't have to be an expert to share or work out loud or learn out loud or build a presence, you just have to share your experiences. And more often than not, I don't know if this has been your experience, Leslie, I'm curious to know. I think more people are interested in hearing about people's experiences rather than, research or empirical data. They want to know, what do people actually experience? And great if it can be backed up with data and actual proof. But I think more people are interested in hearing about people's experiences. I don't know. Has it been your
Yeah,
experience? Yeah.
I think so. I Yeah, sorry, I'm like
It's okay.
processing what you're saying. Um, I think people are more interested in hearing other people's stories because
Yeah,
we learn through story, and it just makes it a lot stickier for our brains to understand, even if what you're describing is based in research, like you said.
sure.
Um, or if you learn about a certain type of research or a certain type of theory or whatever the case may be, run a little experiment for yourself. Do an experiment of one, focus group of one, or
Hmm.
whatever the case may be, sample size of one, and then share it, how this worked out for you. Like, did
Yeah,
this work? Does this align with your experience of how this worked? And even if it doesn't align, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not true. It just wasn't true in that situation. So
sure.
I think, yeah, you're right. There's so much to share, the little things. I think that's the other thing that comes along that I realize as I'm watching content that you produce, or people like Kath Ellis.
Hmm.
I'm trying to think of some others, and they're not coming to the top of mind, but
Sure.
or Devlin Peck or Kara North,
Hmm.
and like finding those little things that as we go along our journey, we think they're just obvious. Like,
Right.
oh, everybody knows that. But then you're like, wait, actually, no, there was a time when I didn't know that. And,
Yep.
there will be other things in the future where maybe I will one day say, oh, everybody knows that. But at this time, this is the thing that I need right now. And so I think that's a real skill set that some people have, of being like, finding those little things, those little nuggets of wisdom that you can
Hmm.
share quickly with people, that may seem obvious, but actually are not super obvious to somebody who's looking for that exact piece of information. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I went
Yeah,
on a tangent there. I
no,
sorry.
I totally agree. I've said to people in the past, if I wanted to write a blog post on, tips for building your portfolio or whatever the case might be, uh, the fact that there's already 11,000 other blog posts on building portfolios, that doesn't mean I shouldn't write my own blog posts on building portfolios. Because if that person out there who does need that information happens to stumble across my blog post first, then I become their expert in that. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Even though there's a million other posts about writing good quiz questions or blog posts or building a portfolio or whatever the case might be. And so the fact that you're not an expert, or the fact that it's something that there's already tons of content out there on, doesn't that's not a reason not to share it, or to
Mhm.
create it, because somebody will stumble across it and appreciate it, and that builds your presence in time. So I'm curious, Leslie, can you talk about one of the things I've experienced, one of the things I've realized in the past as I've tried to explain to people different ways they can build their presence. um, I've talked about, I tell people like, oh, go speak at a conference, or like for me, one of the ways I've done this, I've written a book or whatever the case might be. And then I check myself and I go, gosh, telling people to go speak at a conference, some people who've never shared anything on LinkedIn, telling them to go speak at a conference or write a book, gosh, sounds so impractical or so out of the scope of some people's reality. And so I'm curious, what are some simple, not low level, but simple, practical ways that people can start today building their presence online and getting noticed and online and in the industry and on LinkedIn? What are some simple ways people can do that right now?
So, I think first of all, baby steps. I think there's something to be said about starting off in moderation.
Hmm.
Like, I saw somebody post the other day on LinkedIn that, you should be posting once a day on LinkedIn. I'm like, I post like twice a month sometimes. Like, it depends. But
Yeah.
especially now the podcast isn't fully active right now. But I think finding, if you're not comfortable coming up with original content at the moment, finding articles about topics that you're passionate about, but not just, I would say, don't just, I'm using reblog because I'm still living in Tumblr days, but don't just
Sure.
like repost or share um, things that other people are posting. So I would say if you see an interesting article or you have a lead about it, go read it, do some analysis on your own, and then create an original post or an original something, and you can link to the same article
Hmm.
and share your thoughts on it. Like, how do you feel about this?
Yep.
And I'm not saying like good article with like a smiley emoji. I'm like, no, do like 100-word recap. This is the interesting article. This is why I think it's interesting. Do a bulleted list or something of like, these are interesting points that came across or something, just to
Yep.
show that you're actively engaging on this and you have your own thoughts about it. Because I think that's going to stand up and show a little bit more of what you're about and how you think than just reposting and sharing. So I think that's something that people can do. Um, and if sometimes the time commitment gets so overwhelming that you can schedule these things out using a media planner like Hootsuite or
Hmm.
what's the other one called?
Buffer, I think.
Buffer.
Buffer. Yeah.
Yeah, Buffer. And that will let you like say every Friday I'm going to do one of these articles, so choose one day a month where actually you choose your 4 articles that you're going to read, write up your little 100-word synopsis, and then just schedule them out so that for the rest of the month you're taken care of. You're going to be getting your voice out there on a regular basis, um, of showing like, yes, you're engaging with the developing field out there of instructional design, e-learning, whatever the case may be, and you have thoughts on it, and these are your thoughts. And so what will start to happen is people will start to associate you with those topics,
Yep.
and they will have an subconscious understanding already of your position on those topics. So if for some reason an opportunity comes up and they're like, who do I know in my network that either knows a lot about this or cares a lot about this? And then you become the go-to person for that. So I've
Right.
seen this happen because I'm really excited about XR technology right now. And so I tend to post things that are more centered around that.
Hmm.
And I've had people come to me or present opportunities to me because they know now I'm that person in their mind, of
Yeah.
like, oh, maybe what does Leslie have to say about this, or maybe she'll be interested in this. So I think
Sure.
that's a small, manageable way to sort of get into it, and then you might grow from there and start really posting your own bigger, longer form content, or be inspired to do something else. So
Yeah, I totally agree. I think I totally agree with that. And I think oftentimes people feel that they don't have a unique perspective on something to share. And sometimes, I don't know if this is true for you, Leslie. This is definitely true for me. My unique perspective usually comes out of obviously my own experiences, but through talking it out, through sharing things online, through engaging in a conversation, putting a question out there with an article and sharing and seeing what other people have to say about it. That in itself helps me. And I don't know if this, I'm curious if it's true for you, to better understand your perspective on something, because you're actively putting some critical thinking into it through the act of typing out that 100-word, unique perspective recap. I don't know. Is that true for you?
yeah, so I think what I explained was just one way of doing it, but I think some people use polls in that way,
Sure.
or they're a little bit more soliciting the opinions of or perspectives of other people. That's just not, for whatever reason, I'm not as comfortable using that type of
Yeah.
post, but I think that's true regardless of just the act of putting it together. I think it's like, you don't really understand something as well as when you have to teach it to somebody else. So just the act of finding these things, synthesizing it well enough, getting your thoughts together well enough to even just write that little blurb about it
Hmm.
is a learning exercise for yourself as well. Like, so it's like um anything where you're creating content and putting it out there, I think, and expecting some form of social response to it, you've already automatically raised your emotional stakes in that because you're like, oh, this is social now.
Yep.
So you're much more likely to internalize that and remember that, and yeah, I think you're absolutely right that that is part of the process of learning. I had not thought
Hmm.
about it until just now when you said that, but yes, I think you're right.
Yeah, well, it's part of the reason. I mean, for me, one of the things I learned over the last year or two or so is when somebody reaches out and they say, "Hey, can I pick your brain about, freelancing or something?" Oftentimes, I found, and this is going to sound selfish, but it's true, me spending time talking to, say, you, let's say I'm talking to you about freelancing, you want to benefit from my knowledge or my experience, but really the reality is I'm benefiting from having to talk it out to you, because then I'm learning what I want to say about that thing that might end up being a blog post or a video or a part of a book or something. Like, for at least that's my process. If I'm forced to have to like articulate it and talk it out, that what I'm really doing is working out my own thoughts about that thing, and then
Mhm.
that helps me later on down the line, to do something with that information. All right, so before we get to some of the questions we have coming into our questions pod here, I'm curious to know, what are your thoughts, because I think sometimes the fear or the hesitation with putting yourself out there and doing all the things we're talking about, are the people who are going to disagree. They're going to troll you. They're going to make mean comments, because that exists online. I see it all the time on LinkedIn, and if you ever dare to go on Facebook, which I rarely do anymore, it's even worse there in some of the instructional design communities. What's your words of wisdom on overcoming or that fear, or not letting that be a reason not to put yourself out there?
Whew.
Have you experienced that? I guess. Let me ask that. Have you been on the receiving end of somebody not liking something you put out there online?
Yes, I have. Um, well, yes, especially because a lot of what I post is about just showing my own learning
Mhm.
journey. So I have had people, something that I thought I was proud of, like one of the very first storyline um, things I ever made. This is obviously a while ago, but I posted it and someone just like gave like an eye roll emoji or I don't know, some just
Oh
essentially
gosh.
like saying like this is lame. And I was like, I had to, put my I had to like first take care of my inner child whose feelings
Right.
were hurt.
Yeah.
But then be like, well, what do I it's the very first thing that I've made in storyline. So I'm not gonna come out here, with amazing things to begin with. So
Yeah.
um thankfully since then I really haven't had a lot of negativity, but I think it does always um cross my mind when I am putting something out that's saying, "This is mine. I created it. This is not an
Mhm.
article I'm sharing or whatever. This is like something I made." But it does make me feel like, okay, I think I do get a little bit more into perfectionist mode because I know I'm opening myself up to that critique. But
Yeah.
also, like, I don't even know who that person was. I don't remember their name. They had no connection to me. I'm sure they were just like a connection of a connection or something. So, do I really care what people who mean nothing to me have to say about it? I don't know. Um, but to get over that, I think the reason I don't care anymore is because that was just one voice, and usually there's so many more people saying nice things or having positive reactions, and um, I think yeah, it's easy to be scared, but actually the reward of getting feedback from people um, is so much greater than the cost of whoever these trolls are that might
Yeah.
have something negative to say. So
I agree with that. It's hard. I mean, the idea, the experience that comes to my mind is like, when you go speak at a conference, they send you a few weeks after the conference, you get the feedback from the people who attended your session. And more often than not, the feedback, 99% of it's glowing and people really liked it. And then it's just that one person who, you know, hated it for whatever reason or didn't like you or whatever, and it's hard because you end up just focusing on the one negative thing versus the 100 positive things, or the 99 positive comments. And I think you're
yeah,
absolutely right. Is at the end of the day, I don't know, the thing I tell myself is uh I'll go through a couple different examples, like as a conference presentation. If you didn't like it, why don't you get up and walk out? Or if you didn't
yeah,
like the video I posted, you can turn the channel, right? You can like
yeah,
refresh the page and my thing will go away, or you can block me, or you know,
yeah,
I don't know. It's usually I think the hard lesson to be learned when you're putting yourself out there online, and this I think happens to everybody in some way, shape, or form, is you learn that there's just miserable people out there who want to say nasty things, and it's not
hmm
you, it's really them. And you have to actively practice not to, what I say is, pay it no mind. You have to actively work to not let it bother you. uh, and that's hard, when you're being vulnerable online and putting yourself out there. It's hard when somebody poo-poos all over it, right?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, I've done some other creative endeavors, in my personal life outside of just my career. So, um, I just feel like it the amount of love you can get because people want to see I genuinely believe if you put yourself out there and you are creating content or you're sharing your ideas or you're however that looks like for you.
Hmm.
I 100% believe there are so many people out there who want you to do that. And I know
Yeah.
get down on ourselves and like whatever that is that we're receiving from society that says, "Oh, you're not better than anybody else." It's not about being better than anybody else. You're actually providing a service. You're giving back to the community, and there are so many people out there who are grateful to receive it. And
Hmm.
those are the people that you have to focus on, and not the people who are just, I don't even know what they're doing, but they can just be
Miserable.
grumpy on their own. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I really do think you can do it, uh, if you there's a way to do it where you're actually benefiting others, and if you frame it that way in your own mind, um, then I think it gets a little easier. So,
Yeah, and I think it's a yes to everything you just said, and being okay with the fact that you can't be everything for everybody. You know,
mhm.
you can't be everything for everybody, and that's okay. Um, and then the rest of those people, they can just, I don't know, go troll somewhere else.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to say something way more explicit, but I'm working on not being so explicit.
Okay.
Okay, so let's get to some of the questions we have in the questions pod. And I apologize if I get any names wrong. I will do my best. Mihaela will go with wants to know, how do you keep up with new trends and technologies in the industry? What are your thoughts on that, Leslie? Especially as you're working out loud and learning out loud.
Oh, how do um, I follow a lot of people. So, I think that way of keeping up with trends and technologies, when I knew I wanted to sort of know more about what's going on with XR stuff, I just started following any and all things related to that. Um,
And what's XR
be
for those who don't know?
Oh, sorry. So, augmented or VR,
Okay.
virtual
So it's a
reality.
combination of
So
those two.
yes, so extended reality really is,
Yep.
encompasses both of those things. And so I started following people outside of training, outside of L&D who are in that space because, it's not such a big thing yet in our,
Hmm.
little pond that we all swim in. So I'm starting to figure out what's going on out there and trying to bring it in and interpret it for our community, what this could mean for us. So I think that's it. Like, follow people, who are good at following trends or
Yep.
who talk about it a lot, and just sort of try to engage with it that way. And also, the more you follow those things or the more you engage with content that you're interested in, we all know now at this point that that's how social media algorithms work. So
Hmm.
if you comment or like things about articulate storyline, then your feed is going to show you more things about articulate storyline. So
Yep.
that could be a good thing or a bad thing. So, I guess the lesson there is make sure you're following diverse thinkers out there so that you see lots of different things and not just get an echo chamber and see only about the same tools over and over and over and over
Yeah.
again.
Yeah. For me, the way I keep up with technologies and trends, I take a very passive approach to it. I am not somebody to dive in heads first into something, and not that I don't want to learn about it, but the reason why I'm passive about it is because one of the things I've learned about our industry, and I'm sure this is true in a lot of other industries, but in our industry, in my experience, uh, we latch onto trends, and we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how that thing really fits into what it is that we
Hmm.
do. XR is a really great example, like augmented reality,
Hmm.
virtual reality. I think we're still trying to figure out, like, what's the fit for function use case for augmented reality in,
Hmm.
corporate L&D or L&D in general. Or, if I go back, when the Apple Watch came out, I remember I was at a conference and there was a presentation about how, all the future of e-learning, people are going to be taking their compliance courses on their little Apple Watch, and I remember going, I don't know about that. And so I take a passive approach, and I let those things, like, for me, this, I don't know if this is not going to really practical answer, but like, I let them sit on the periphery. I'm aware of them. And when it is time for it to be something I need to pay attention to, it will move out of my periphery and onto my radar. I don't know how, if
Hmm.
that makes any sense. What I don't do is I don't try to I don't go into it really contrived, going, I have to learn everything about X API. I couldn't
Yeah,
write an
yeah,
X API statement to save my life. But if I needed to, if a client said you needed to, then I'd go learn about it.
yeah.
My point in saying that is I think people put so much pressure on themselves to stay current with what's current technologies and trends, and the reality is I don't think that's always necessary. So yeah,
Or really possible. I mean, there's an
yes, or
explosion right
possible.
now of options. So I think, yeah, I think your strategy is good of like just having a peripheral awareness of a lot of most of the things. But
Yeah.
if 5% of these tools, attracts your eye, attracts your heart, then you can
Hmm.
dive in and investigate more. But there's no way to be an expert or be 100% knowledgeable about all the tools because there's just so many of them now out
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
possible. So,
Yeah, I agree. All right, good. Okay, so our next question comes from Sadie. Sadie wants to know, how do you manage the costs of developing content or finding accessible, affordable content authoring tools? So let's answer that question from the perspective of building your presence, creating content online. I mean, because I think that's kind of separate from talking about building training content as an employee or for clients. And
mhm.
so the cost for creating content to build your presence. Um, that's a hard one. I'm curious to know your thoughts on that, Leslie, because I think, you know, you can. The beauty is that we all have the ability, like we all have a film studio in our pocket. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like the reality is that you could theoretically do a lot of these things for free, and the cost is your time. But in my experience, and this is true for me, I don't know if this is true for you, Leslie, the more you start putting yourself out there, creating content or being active online, you create a YouTube channel or a blogcast. I was going to say a podcast. You start wanting to up your levels of quality, and then the more that can become exponentially more expensive. So I don't know, for you, like with your podcast and being online, how have you balanced the time commitment, the cost commitment, all of that good stuff?
Yeah. So actually, the podcast is pretty. It was not a huge financial investment when I started. I think since then I've upgraded my microphone. But
Mhm.
along this all, and maybe I pay for the thing that I pay for is just a transcription service. I use Otter AI to transcribe the audio file into a transcript for my website, and I pay for the website. So really, those are the only two things I really had to pay for.
Yeah.
I borrowed a mic from my roommate. Anchor is for free. Zencaster is free.
Hmm.
I had GarageBand on my computer, or you could download Audacity. That's free. So it's not a huge financial investment to if you're, but it is a time investment because I'm doing all of
Yeah.
it on my own. A lot of people outsource the editing or the website maintenance or all of these different things that I just tend to do on my own.
Yeah.
Um, so for that first podcast specifically, you can do that relatively cheaply. But for other content, I use Canva for almost all of my all of the design for my posts that I do on LinkedIn that are about my own projects that I'm working on. I use Canva. Hootsuite and Buffer both have a free version that you can use where you can schedule up to a certain amount of posts a month. And I think right now it's like 4, maybe
Sure.
less.
Yeah.
But for a month is still once a week, which if you're posting once a week on LinkedIn, you're still doing better than 95% of all people on LinkedIn. So
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
so I I don't think for just building your presence, it's more of a time commitment and just a commitment to doing it. And so
Hmm.
whatever tools you need to use to get yourself organized to do that, um, that's probably the most important thing. It's not like you need a storyline, license or
Sure.
anything to do that. So.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right with everything about how much of this can be done for free, and so much of it is it's about the investment of your time. As you were describing all of that, it made me realize my perspective is different as a small business owner, as a freelancer. One of the things that I do is, if let's say, I want to invest in a new camera for YouTube content, or a new microphone for the content I do on YouTube. Like, I don't make money directly from that, those efforts, right? And so what I try to do is, whenever I want to invest in something new or shiny for something that I do that doesn't generate money, I try to also go, well, how can I also use this as part of the business that does help me pay the bills? And so I think about, for example, as you look at, you can't see the lighting equipment around me, or the camera, or my audio recorder here. I have several $1,000s worth of equipment around me, but I was able to justify that, not because I was using it for creating content for YouTube, but because I used it for a client project to help them create video content. And so it kind of
Hmm.
paid for itself. And then I had the dual purpose of using it for other parts of my business to help me create content. So that's the way I try to view it, as I go, how can I use this in multiple different ways that can benefit not just my presence online, but also my business,
Yeah.
that's how I've taken a look at it. And of course, for me, it's all tax deductible, which is also really
Right.
nice too. So
Well, I will add one more thought on
yeah.
this before we move on, which is that I specifically chose podcasts, I think, because there's a lower bar to
Yeah.
entry, and I knew I had the equipment, and I have a background in audio engineering. So that was like very easy for me to get into. And so I do acknowledge that, like, I probably would not jump into doing a YouTube channel, because
Right.
I also feel a very similar, like, oh, but that will take an investment. Like, I don't have, but at the same time, I think if you just go into it of like, this is just my what my medium for sharing, and it doesn't have to be 100% professionally produced, or unless, I mean, I think it's different for someone like you. You're a business owner, and so having things look super professional um, is a different thing than me. If I were to make a YouTube channel to share content, I'm
Hmm.
not necessarily trying to the end goal is not the same. I'm just trying
Sure.
to show
Yep.
myself as a learner. These are the things I'm interested in, and I'm going to share some of what I'm learning with you out there. And it's not necessarily me trying to brand myself as a business. So
Yep.
these are two different things. So one, I think your route takes a little bit more of a financial investment than if I were to jump on YouTube. I may still just be using my camera on my phone or on my computer, and have the same setup that I have here, which is just a lamp
Sure.
pointed at the wall and not like professional lighting or anything. So it's just it's what your end goal is, I think.
Well, and I also think one of the things you mentioned, you said you had a background in audio engineering. That's such an important piece, is going, what medium is most approachable for you where you're at right now. When I started doing stuff on YouTube, I went and bought like an $80 Logitech HD webcam, and I used that as my little camera. And the video quality, if I look back on it now, it's like, it was rather embarrassing. But that's what I knew how to use at the time. But over the years, I'd learned about video production, and so I was able to take those skills and apply it in a totally different context. Same is true for my book. Like, I didn't just magically, learn how to self-publish a book. I worked in a job where I helped self-publish books. And so I learned that and applied that in other ways. And so I think part of it is going, well, what skills, abilities do you have right now? And how can you use that then to, share whatever it is you're going to share in whatever medium you're going to share it, right?
Yeah,
Good. Okay. I think we
definitely.
have time for one more question. We'll try to do two more, but we'll do this one for sure. Kathleen Volk. Hey, Kathleen. Kathleen wants to know, do you have any suggestions for newbies on how to approach experts, leaders in the field? Your podcast makes these conversations so approachable, but what's the best approach for keeping the conversation going, reaching out for advice, etc.? I don't know. We kind of talked about this before we went live, but what are your thoughts on that, Leslie?
Yeah, so I think even though I use the podcast as a way to connect with people, I don't go into those conversations with any sort of preconceived notion of, what I'm going to get out of this, except that we'll record this conversation and share it with the world, and hopefully they get some benefit out of it. It is a good starting point for relationships. It's not a smoking gun though. Like, it doesn't guarantee that just because we record an episode together, that I will be able to maintain that. Some people, I've maintained it a lot easier than others, and that for whatever reasons.
Yep.
And so some people that I've met through the podcast, I talk to, almost weekly at this point. And some people, I talked to them that one time and I never talked to them again. And it's just because our interests don't match up, or, our paths haven't crossed again. But if for some reason in the future something comes up where I do think of that person, at least now I have this one touch point where I can refer back to and say, oh, hey, this thing happened, or I heard about this and it made me think of you. So I think maybe looking at it, as far as networking, you just sort of have to have the conversations without any sort of agenda. And then later down the line, you may connect with that person again. But I don't know, I'm just rambling at this point.
That's fine.
I'm trying to say. Yeah, I guess because I'm looking at this question, I'm thinking the best approach for keeping the conversation going, reaching out for advice. I hardly ever reach out to people again if I need something, unless I have really, really maintained that relationship for other reasons.
Yeah.
So it's not like I can't, just because I've talked to this person once on my podcast, I can go to them and say, can you give me a referral to this job that I know your company's looking for, or whatever. It's just, it's not quite that transactional. So I would just say, use it as a way to meet people. And then if you find things that they're interested in as you're going along in time, and just reach back out to them and say, this made me think of you, or I think this might be useful to you, or just continue with giving more than taking, is what I guess I'm trying to say in a very long roundabout way.
That's fine. I mean, my advice would be, I guess, know why you're reaching out to that person in the first place. I've talked about this online before, is sometimes, the biggest, not turn off is not the right word, phrase. What's most discouraging is when people reach out and they just say, hi, can you help me with e-learning? And they don't say who they are, why they reached out to me. And that is just, and I want to be like, well, why are you reaching out to me? Who are you? I guess know why you're reaching out to that person, and explain that when you reach out to them. And I think sometimes, when you do connect with those people, there's times where people have reached out to me and we've connected and talked online, and, I gave them whatever advice I have, but there wasn't real connection there. And so that relationship wasn't maintained, not because it wasn't worth the time. It was just, we didn't jive, and we're not going to jive with everybody, I don't know. That's how I do it. And sometimes the conversations I have with people, and Kathleen Volk, this because we've both talked online before, is sometimes the conversations we have are about random things, like building homes, or, switching jobs or whatever, and so I don't know, for me, it's about, I connect and I maintain relationships longest with the people that I actually have I can make a personal connection with first. So, yeah. Well, good. Okay. We are at our time. So Leslie, where can people find you, connect with you, follow you online, or where can they check out the podcast?
Yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn. I'm probably on LinkedIn more than I should be. So you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. And the podcast is, the website is that'sawesomeid.com. We're sort of on hiatus now, but I'm getting geared up for season 2. I have a few episodes recorded and I want to get a few more in the bank before I launch it. But before the end of the year, I will be launching season 2 of That's Awesome ID. So I'm super grateful to everyone who has listened and given feedback. It really makes my day when I hear from people. So
yeah. Well, good. Well, Before we say goodbye, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Of course, if you want to learn more about growing your e-learning career, you can check me out at the eLearning Designers Academy at elearningacademy.io. And of course, feel free to join us inside the eLearning Designers community. It's our free online community where you can connect with others in the industry, participate in our monthly challenges, and a bunch of other cool stuff at community.elearningacademy.io. Thank you so much for joining me today, Leslie, and thank you everybody for watching. And if you're watching this on YouTube, watching the recording, make sure to like and subscribe and click the little bell thing, whatever the bell thing does. Click on those buttons down there. Beyond that, have a great day, everybody. Thanks, Leslie.
Thank you.